Hi, Rex Welch here at RW Mods. Today I'm doing a video here on what I do to rebuild a nitro engine. I get the question what's all involved when I rebuild a nitro engine. I charge $30 to rebuild a nitro engine. It doesn't include parts if I happen to need a rod or a bearing or something. I also do a sleeve resize service. If you rebuild your own stuff, send me a piston and sleeve. First thing I do when I do an engine is obviously take it all apart. Kind of inspect things as I take it apart. One thing I look at is the piston. Look at the carbon buildup on the top. Notice if there's any pitting on the top. If an engine's been detonating, sometimes the piston top will look like it's been sandblasted. Sometimes there's some scratches on the side of the piston, which most times is evidence of a rear bearing going out. Sometimes some dirt can get in the engine and leave some small scratches, but a lot of times some small scratches on the side of the piston mean that the rear bearing's going out. Little pieces of metal flake off, go through the engine. It doesn't mean the engine's junk. Most times it runs just like it did when it was new. Some guys will send me a piston and sleeve, just the piston and sleeve for a resize, and I'll send them back a message, hey, it looks like your rear bearing's going out, and they're kind of like, how do you know that? But just from experience, I see that once in a while, there's some small scratches on there, actually more than you think. And so take it apart, I'm inspecting things, look at the crank. So I mic the crank. The biggest thing on an engine is to know whether it's worth rebuilding or not, is the amount of crank wear and rod wear. Or if there's any other thing, obviously if you broke the piston or something else is damaged. But the main thing on an engine, whether it's worth rebuilding or not, is if you needed a crank and a rod, you're looking at probably worthwhile just not rebuilding it and buying a new engine. And when you send an engine to me for a rebuild, I take it all apart and I say, hey, this crank's toast. It's not really worth rebuilding. I don't charge. You send it to me and I'm not able to get it. I'll just put it back together and send it back to you. Obviously, you have to just pay the return shipping, but I don't charge you. So to check a crank, use a mic. Most crank pins are about 196 thousandths. Some are slightly larger, but you'll see as you move the mic and turn the crank, you'll get some wear. The cranks will wear all around. The reason they only wear on one side, or mostly wear on one side, is the crank's spinning this way, and the piston and rod are on it. And the piston, as it fires at top dead center, it pushes the crank. It pushes the crank, and it'll wear on the top side of the rod, and it'll wear on this side of the crank. So as you measure around the crank, it'll be an oval shape, and then the rod on the top. They call that the thrust side of it. So when you measure a crank, you want to just check it all the way around. This one I'm getting about a 0.5 thousandths wear. I did a video on this engine as a review, so if you want to look at that sometime. And then so I'll check the crank for wear, then I'll check the rod for wear. I'll use this bore gauge, and just like the crank, you want to move the rod around. I'm not getting much wear here, but as you move it, the needle's moving. But each graduation on this bore gauge is 1,000, so between the 0 and 10 is 1,000. So it's a pretty precision bore gauge. So not getting really anywhere. I'm getting a little bit of deviation, but that's mainly just me moving it. I brought I just brought in a used rod, and this is what typically a worn rod will look like. So it's pretty good. One way, I'll turn it 90 degrees. I'm getting over a 2,000ths wear there, and that's right on the top side there. So, and it can be for the average guy, maybe doesn't have the tools, might put the crank and rod together and feel, man, that thing feels really loose on there. You know, it's really moving around. It's hard to tell without the right equipment to know how much wear you got, especially if you put it on. I have this old crank. I was going to measure that too. See how much slop that is. So this crank here, I was getting about 195 on the high side, and then down to even like 4,000ths wear. And they'll wear typically a little more towards the outside of the pin versus close. You get some more. So this would consider a junk crank. And then this rod at 2,000ths wear, I recommend, you know, at 2,000ths replacing the rod. This is an OS rod, so it probably most likely had a DLC crank. So you had 2,000ths rod wear, but the crank, the DLC cranks normally don't wear, so you had 2,000ths overall wear. So if you had a crank that had 2,000ths wear and the rod that had 2,000ths wear, you got 4,000ths total slop. And I kind of look at the total slop more than just one or the other. So if you had 1,000ths and 1,000ths, it's probably getting there. I recommend over 3,000ths total slop. It would still run fine. Maybe just put it in in your toolbox as a spare engine. It'll still run fine, but you're not going to get a season, a summer out of it or anything. So, so I inspect the wear. Anything else seems abnormal with the engine. After I get the engine, I'll kind of evaluate everything, and then send an email back. Hey, it looks good. I'm getting just a little bit of crank rod wear. The only thing I recommend is a front bearing. Normally, when I have an engine apart, it's a good idea to put a front bearing in. I use Avid double sealed bearings. I mainly replace them with steel. These are $6. I do have ceramics also, but I kind of over the years just like the steel bearings. Dirt gets in the front bearings over time, and dirt will wear a ceramic ball more than a steel ball. So the ceramic balls are fine, but with a little bit of grit and dirt in there, they'll get loose faster. So I recommend, there's really very little performance difference between a steel and a ceramic front bearing. Now on the rear bearings, I normally, if I'm replacing it, I recommend a ceramic. You have more balls, and it's it's a little more of a performance advantage because they're lighter, and so I got so I send an email to the customer saying what I found, what I recommend. They say go ahead and do that. Then I'll start working on the engine. Work on the piston sleeve. I use a machinist stone, and I will make the top of the sleeve flat. There's usually a low spot. I don't know if you can see in the video there. There's a little spot there that didn't quite clean up, but you want to make sure you get everything flat. And then I'll also kind of drag it on the stone, get any burrs or any high spots off the outside of the sleeve too. And then I'll take the piston, clean it up, and then I'll polish the piston top. And you want to be careful not to round the edges or anything when you're working on the piston. I don't I don't do anything to the outside of the piston unless it does have the scratches or it got some dirt. Then I'll polish up the outside of the piston with some really fine grit paper. And then to do the top of the piston, I'll use on a piece of machine surface, use a really fine, like 1000 grit sandpaper and some WD-40 on it, some wet or dry, and just work it like that. And that's not, I mean, that's not polished with any polish or anything. That's just the way it comes off with the really fine paper. So I got everything cleaned up again after I did the piston top and everything. So I'll resize the sleeve. And normally on most engines you have a chrome sleeve, brass sleeve with chrome on the inside, and aluminum piston. And the piston will wear more than the sleeve. And so to renew the compression and the pinch at the top, I have to squeeze the outside of the sleeve. So I think there's only one person that sells equipment to do that. I personally use my own way. I'm a machinist, so I develop my own way to do it. I don't usually tell people how I do it, but I do know there's others that do it the same way I do, kind of develop their own way too. So the way I do it, I can move it even less than a 10,000ths and go in increments until I get the right feel. And it is a judgment call. I know guys, when they start doing them themselves, they've asked me questions like how tight to get them, and so normally when I do a piston sleeve, I'll do it so it's you just can't see when you push up in there, you just can't see the wrist pin. And it's kind of over time I've kind of developed the way I like to do it. Normally I'd like to get an engine to be about like it was after a gallon, after it's fully broke in. So when you get an engine rebuilt from me, it's not going to need 8 tanks of break-in. Normally I recommend just preheating it. Anytime you rebuild an engine like that and you got the pinch renewed and stuff, it's best to preheat an engine. It will just last, the compression will just last longer. So I recommend just preheating and running a couple tanks on the bench, or just run it easy on the track. Maybe just don't get it race tuned, but something just slightly richer, and run it. Now if it did have a rear bearing replaced, then I recommend even 4 tanks before you just want to be easy on the RPMs with the new bearing, kind of let that bearing seat in. So we got the piston sleeve resized, got that ready to go. And then one thing I do is I polish the piston top. I'll spin it up in a lathe with some real fine paper and WD-40 on there, and work that and get all the carbon off it. And then I use a little bit of aluminum polish and run that in there on a rag and clean it up. And then I'll spray it off with WD-40, blow it out, make sure there's no grit anywhere. And there's a performance advantage. It does help to get the carbon off there. The piston top and the head button will reflect heat better, keep the heat out of the engine itself, and go out the exhaust, and it'll run better. Many times I've rebuilt engines, for guys, and once in a while I get some people and more than one person that say, the thing ran better than it even did new. And I can't really explain that, but I do know they run as good as new when I'm done. So then when I clean the carburetor, I don't clean that the same way I clean everything else. I'll use a hot water alkali, kind of a pressure washer thing for everything. The carb, I don't want water getting in the boot here. I don't want to take it apart. I don't usually mess with the carbs, but I will clean them up. I'll spray it down with some WD-40, blow it off with the air hose a couple times, wipe down the outside, kind of make sure it looks good and everything. So, and then I don't mess with carbs usually, unless someone specifically ask for new O-rings or something, but I don't usually adjust your tune. If I see, I see enough engines, if it's an over-Aussie or an OS, and I kind of see that the needles are way off, I'll let you know, hey, it looks like your idle gap's way wide, or your high speed's too rich, or whatever, and kind of recommend it. And sometimes with an engine, if the pinch is real bad, or whatever, some guys will mess with the tune to try and get it to run better, so it'll be messed up just from trying to keep it running. So the rear bearings, like I said, I almost always recommend the front bearing. The rear bearing, it's kind of a judgment call. It's when I clean everything up, I get the oils out. The rear bearing, with when you first take it apart, will have some oil residue in there, some castor oil from the fuel, and it'll feel pretty smooth in there and not feel loose because there's also thicker oil in there. And so when I clean everything, I just spray a little WD-40 to keep the rust off the bearing. I'll use a thick oil when I assemble the engine, but I want a thin oil in there to kind of feel if it's smooth. And then I'll also I'll install the crank and the new front bearing, and I'll put that in there. And this doesn't have the front bearing in it, and then I'll kind of be able to tell if there's any slop in that bearing. And it's just kind of years of experience, and it's it's just an experience thing. It's not a guarantee that bearing is good, but I most times can tell. And if there's any doubt, I'll err on the side of recommended it be replaced. But and then maybe at the end of this video, I'll show how to do a bearing replacement, because I am gonna, this bearing's good, but I'm gonna put a ceramic in it just because it's got a few gallons on it. For next year I'll put a ceramic in it. So that's about it on what I do to rebuild. I've got another older video on how to assemble it, so I'm not going to go that far. That's about it, and thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Keep up. I'll try and keep doing some videos like this. So thanks for watching. So I'm going to do the bearing replacement. I had someone ask before, commenting on one of my videos about doing a video on replacing the rear bearing. I got this Huddy tool. Honestly, I don't use this tool very often. I have in the shop, I have a pretty good system it's just faster than this, but I do bring this along to the races with bearings and stuff in case someone needs a bearing, or if I need to replace a bearing on my own. So I'm going to go through this quick and just replace this bearing. Sometimes they're a little stubborn to get in here. So you get that collet in there, and then you back this off, kind of puts pressure on there, and then so you get that installed like that, and then you just spin around there. So the bearing is in there. Want to make sure you clean out behind there. Sometimes there's some stuff behind the bearing. And then we'll install it. So then to install the front bearing, just have to take this off, put it back in there, grab the front bearing, slide that on there. That's it. Bearings in there, all ready to go. Thanks for watching.